So then before there was some confusion about HTTP methods I've understood. So GET is the common way. That's what your browser uses by default. It retrieves a resource, and the implicit requirement is that it is valid for a web server to make the request 0 or multiple times. 0 if it can determine from additional data in your headers that the file, that its cache should still be valid. So if you don't, for dynamic pages, it normally adds a little header thing that says, okay, this page cannot be cached. Caching this page is invalid. And that means that the browser will not try to re-download it. Or if it says, okay, I try, it often makes there's another request called head, which is basically like get, except head will not get the contents, it will only get the headers. Why does it do that? So that it can read those headers and say, okay, what has this file been changed since this resource been changed since I cached it? If not, I don't need to download all the contents of this resource. So that makes it faster. And that's all the things that you do with static files fairly easily, and your web server does this all for you, and it speeds up everything a lot. But dynamic resources obviously cannot necessarily be cached. Yes, you can add the caching information in if you want to, if that's relevant in your context, but you need to do that manually, because by default systems that do dynamic pages assume that caching is invalid, and because they can't know when it's valid or not, because, well, it depends on the dynamic behavior actually present. So then there's the post. So post is basically directed to a specific resource, and it provides it with information that can lead to an update of one form or another. What exactly happens is, when we look at these standards, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. So you have the GET request here. You have the head request, we have the post. So the semantics, so it's about the specific semantics of whatever the resource is. So here we say we see this resource. So it's not a file. It is a resource. So, and that can be, so it provides a bit of data and then whatever it processes. One of the things is a post may not be automatically be repeated. So yes, you can use it to create a resource, and then you should send the 201 created response, including a location header where the new resource actually has been created. So if you have a list of users and you say post a user to that list, then that can create a new user resource and say, okay, here the user resource has now been created. And then we have the put request. So the put request makes a request to create a resource at or update the resource at a particular location. So it says, this is the contents, put this here. And so basically, like it says here, you need to it needs to result in an equivalent representation. So that means it should be the same content or basically equivalent. So put is there for creating resources in that way. So in many cases, if you have a resource that has an ID and the location is based on that ID, you don't want your users to provide the ID. The server will provide the ID because it knows which IDs are already in use. The client cannot know that. It could very well be that it looked for a free ID. When it tried to create the resource, someone else already came in and used and created another resource with that ID. The server can actually handle that conflict and just find the next unused ID exactly at the point where needed. So that's the put request, and then there is the delete. So there is a lot of specifics on this, as you can see. And the delete request basically says delete this resource. But traditionally, web browsers don't use delete or put at all. There's a few other requests, but we don't really want to go into. Be careful. The W3 Schools documentation on this is, as many W3 Schools documentations, misleading. Doesn't tell you enough details to actually understand what's going on. It's just confusing. From my perspective, I never ever would recommend anyone to look at W3 Schools. If you want good resources on how something works, use the Mozilla pages. They are much better in quality and accuracy. But in general, the idea between the HTTP methods is put for creating resources, get for reading resources, post for updating resources, and delete for deleting them. Yes, I know many people like W3 Schools. I just don't. I find them misleading. There is a lot of misleading information on W3 Schools. Probably not everything, and I haven't looked too much in the past, but in general the resources are just not good enough. And they are misleading, and I would say misleading is worse than missing information. I find Mozilla developer website to be very accurate in what it says. Although it can be a little bit harder to access for students, which I can understand W3 Schools provides the simplified version. But sometimes the simplified version is also a wrong version. You need to be very careful with that. Or when you actually want to know what it does, go back to what the standard says. Yes, the standard is a little bit dense. And in the case of Post, it's a lot dense. Some of the information is there for web server implementers rather than for users. But that is the source. If you want to know how HTML elements work or how CSS elements work, the standards are quite readable and they explain exactly what it does.